But glacial rivers are a real challenge for riverboat captains like Maddie and her predecessors because they change all the time. You look out ahead of us in the Tanana Valley, you see there are numerous channels and waterways and sloughs and side streams that all make up the Tanana River when you take them as a whole. The Chena is just one channel, so you can memorize where the deep water is. Not in a river like the Tanana, though, because the channels shift around all the time. You come through here, headed out to the Bering Sea. By the time you come back, the deep water could have shifted to a completely different place. So all the captains have to learn to do what's called reading these rivers, because you can't mark channels, you can't make maps, you can't rely on your memory. You deal with the river in front of you that day. Just like we might open a book and read words on the page to find out what the story is, captains read rivers by looking at surface patterns, and that tells them what's going on underneath. If the water is really flat and glassy in one area, or churning and rippling in another, depending on what side it's cutting in on, what side it's filling in on, those are all indicators to a skilled captain where to go and not get parked up on a sandbar. Maddie knows how to do that, as does everyone, whoever takes the helm. And the captains of old were revered for their ability to do that. To use these shallow draft vessels and not get stuck all the time.
This is really shallow right there.
You might not believe it, but this area, the interior of Alaska, is almost a desert region. We only get 12 inches of precipitation in the average year, rain and snow combined. 2 fewer. If our cutoff was at 10, we'd be subarctic desert. And there's no tidal impact on this river because the ocean's 1,200 miles away. The reason we have the volume of water we do is because of what's happening in the Tanana. You get a stretch of warm days, the snow that accumulated over the winter melts, carries silt out and water, the Tanana rises, the Chena River we're in rises with it because they bump into each other out here, to the point that mud bars and river grasses are all covered up by water in the peak of the summer. But then as we get past that peak, the whole system begins to reverse. The rivers drain out, snow repacks the glaciers, and it happens again next year. And we get asked a lot by people concerned about flooding. We don't have to worry about that because there's a flood control facility on the Chena. So if it gets too high to the point that it's maybe going to threaten the town or people's properties, there's a big gate they can shut, divert the Chena into the Tanana in a different spot, about 15, 20 miles up the road, down the road, I guess, in south of us. So we don't have to worry about that now, thankfully. We had a big flood in 1967 that covered up 95% of the streets with water, so we're glad that they built that facility. And now that we're pointed back upstream, the same direction that the salmon swim, when they get the urge to reproduce, we'll use our TV monitors to show you a clip of one of these fish wheels actually catching some salmon, if you'd like to see how they work. And no external motor or engine is needed to make that operate. It's powered entirely by river current. And if you look at our film clip, you'll see it catch one, the right-hand basket. They'll scoop salmon up out of the water along the cut bank, drop them into that trough down at the bottom. They'll eventually wriggle out through the chute and end up in the catch box. And not one single bit of any of these salmon will get wasted. It's all going to be used to either feed people or dogs, and we're going to learn about that from Shondine, who's over to our left again and on your monitor. Good afternoon again. Nanda Doja, my friend.
Doinda, Shondine Sauza. My name is Shondine. I'm Koyukon Athabaskan and Navajo, and I grew up in a rural community called Stevens Village, which is along the Yukon River. And for as long as I can remember, I've been going to fish camp every summer.
Yeah, a time to not only work, but also, when you were young, to learn the traditions and the stories, have all of that passed down. Great family time. And we'll get to the subject of the work in a moment, but tell us first, if you would, what all these different things are around you, because each one has a purpose, obviously.
Of course, our fish camp here is what you would typically see along the Yukon or Tanana rivers during the summer months. Each summer, families would pack up and head about 30 miles away from their village to their respective family's fish camp. My family's fish camp is about 45 miles away from Rampart, and in fact, my dad and brother went to fish camp today. And one of my earliest childhood memories is building a fish wheel with my father, like you can see in the water. The fish wheel is an efficient fish catching machine that allows us to catch enough salmon to sustain our dog teams and families throughout the winter months. Back on shore, we have the canvas wall tents. That's where you would sleep in the summer. Closest to me is the air drying racks. That's where I would hang the salmon before putting it into the smokehouse. And the smokehouse is a large, permanent building behind me. The smokehouse is the key to turning salmon into a lightweight, dehydrated, and fully preserved food source. We would then store our salmon in a cache, and that's a cabin built on stilts next to the smokehouse. It's built on stilts to keep any animals away. The small boxes you see in between the canvas wall tents are the dog houses. We would always bring our dogs to camp to act as a natural alarm system if any large game animals were to come by.
Yeah, like, big old bear strolling through, thinking about stealing salmon. It's nice to have a warning if that's coming, because it is a lot of work to get it up there. And on the subject of the work, looks like you've been doing some processing since we saw you last.
Yes, well, here's a chum salmon, and like I said before, this is a chum salmon. Now here in the interior of Alaska, we get 3 types of salmon: a single run of the king and silver, and 2 runs of the chum. Now because the chum are slightly lesser quality, and because we get twice as much, they are usually reserved for the dogs. The process that I began here is the basic dog food cut. I began by removing the head, and by separating the fillet from the backbone. I still have some meat left on the backbone, and since we waste nothing in our culture, we would make it into stew for our dogs here at camp. Same goes for the fish head. Now if this were a higher quality fish head, like the king or silver, it would be made into fish head soup. In our culture, it's considered a delicacy.
Help me. How is fish head
Who said
soup?
that?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not old enough.
Well, yeah, okay.
Smart.
Ask her in about 60 years. Why all the slicing into your fillet? What does that help?
Well, right now I'm scoring the fillet, which is making diagonal cuts through the flesh down to the skin. Scoring creates a larger surface area that allows the smoke to work deeper and further into the fillet, further dehydrating it.
And you'll see when she holds it up, it's a nice picture actually. All of those vents pop open, and now that can lose practically all of its water weight, but none of the nutritional value for the dogs. It'll all get sealed right in there. Good work. Why though
Humans could eat it as well.
not just take it into the smokehouse, because that's all covered, there's smoke in there. Why would you want to expose it outside here?
Well, we don't like to put a wet drippy salmon straight into the smokehouse because it will mold. Instead, we'll hang it on the air drying racks until it develops a nice sheen or glaze. Now keep in mind, every family and region has their own techniques and preferences. Because we're making food for our dogs here at camp, it would be rotated in the smokehouse for at least 2 to 3 weeks until it's fully dehydrated, weighs less than a pound, and looks something like this.
Yeah, and you bundle that up just like firewood, take it out on the dog sled, it's nice and light, use it in the winter on the trap line. I'm not thinking though that probably tastes a lot better than firewood in that condition though, so what about when you're making salmon for your family? Any differences?
Well, for our family, we like to start off with a higher quality salmon, like the king or silver, and add a little more care and time into the process. We would then wash the fish really well, but we like fillets, but we also cut into long vertical pieces called salmon strips. Either way, they would be soaked in a brine. My family likes to use brown sugar, honey, and salt. It would then hang on the air drying racks and then be placed into the smokehouse, but for a much shorter amount of time, maybe 2 to 3 days, because we like a much softer texture. And when we smoke it, we use different woods. For ourselves, we like to use cotton or alder wood for a much sweeter flavor. And for the dogs, they use spruce wood, driftwood. They're not too picky.
Yeah, just whatever's laying around. Good recipe idea there, though, Sean Dean, with the alder smoke and all. I want to remember that. And while we make our way up to the planks here, could you share with us a little bit more about what we're going to see?
Of course. Well, I'm glad to say that your guides and I are excited to show you around the Chena Indian Village and share some of our culture with you. This village is the replica of the old Chena village that Captain Jim visited while running freight. When the old Chena village became inaccessible by boat, it largely ceased to exist. But because preserving the native culture is so important to Captain Jim, he and his family have recreated the living museum that you see here. This village is the replica of the old